The warnings had been precise and terrifying. Every instruction during her brief training period had reinforced the same message. Expect the worst from your captors. So when the transport vehicle lurched to a final stop and she heard the metal gates scraping open somewhere beyond the canvas covering, her entire body went rigid with anticipation of what horrors might await. She was 22 years old, trained as a medical auxiliary for barely 8 months before the collapse of her unit. And now here she stood among dozens of other captured women, clutching a cloth bag that contained the few possessions she had managed to keep through the chaos of surrender. The sunlight that flooded in when the canvas was pulled back felt aggressive in its brightness, and she had to shield her eyes as she climbed down from the truck bed onto packed earth that radiated heat even through the soles of her worn shoes. Texas, someone had whispered during the journey. They were somewhere in Texas now, which meant nothing to her except distance, an impossible expanse of ocean and land separating her from everything she had known. The other women moved in tight clusters, their eyes scanning the perimeter as though mapping escape routes or identifying threats, and she found herself doing the same, despite knowing how futile it would be. The fence stretched in every direction, tall and crowned with wire that caught the light in wicked gleams. Beyond it stood the guards, and this was the moment she had been dreading most. Everything she had been told insisted that American soldiers lacked discipline, that they viewed captured women as something other than prisoners of war, that the protection supposedly guaranteed by international agreements meant nothing to men drunk on victory. She had steeled herself for leering faces, for rough hands, for the immediate assertion of power that she assumed would define this new existence. Instead, what she saw made no sense at all. The sentries stood at perfect intervals along the fence line, their rifles held in identical positions against their shoulders, their uniforms immaculate despite the heat. They might have been carved from stone for all the expression they showed. Not one turned his head to watch the new arrivals with anything resembling curiosity or malice. They simply stood there, fulfilling some function she did not yet understand, their faces blank and professional. An officer emerged from a building near the gate, and beside him walked a woman in uniform, who immediately began speaking in clear, formal Japanese. The instructions were simple and delivered without emotion. Form 2 orderly lines. Proceed to the intake area. Follow all directions given by staff. There would be no deviation, no confusion, no chaos. The voice carried authority but not cruelty, and this absence of hostility felt more disorienting than threats would have been. She had prepared herself to endure abuse, not bureaucracy. As the lines formed and began moving forward through the gate, she kept waiting for the facade to crack, for the real nature of her captivity to reveal itself. Surely the professionalism was temporary, a performance for some observer she could not see. But as she passed within arm's reach of the nearest guard, he did not even glance in her direction. His eyes remained fixed on some point in the middle distance, as though the dozens of frightened women shuffling past him did not exist at all. The intake tent was vast and organized with a precision that reminded her uncomfortably of hospital work. Tables were arranged in rows, each staffed by personnel wearing armbands that identified their roles. Medical officers, administrative clerks, translators, all working with the kind of efficient detachment that suggested this process had been repeated countless times. When her turn came, she gave her name and age and unit designation to a young American who recorded the information without meeting her eyes, his pen moving across forms in triplicate. She was issued a metal tag stamped with numbers that meant nothing to her, and the translator explained in mechanical Japanese that this tag must be kept on her person at all times. It served as identification, as proof of her status as a protected prisoner under the conventions governing warfare. The word protected hung in the air like something she should reach for but could not quite grasp. Protected from what? From whom? The guards themselves? That interpretation seemed to be confirmed when the translator began reading from a printed sheet, enunciating each rule with careful emphasis. There would be no fraternization between prisoners and military personnel. guards were forbidden from initiating personal contact outside their assigned duties. Any requests or concerns must be directed through official channels and interpreted staff. Violations of this policy would result in severe disciplinary action for American soldiers. The phrasing struck her as backwards. She had expected rules governing prisoner behavior, restrictions on movement and speech and assembly. Instead, she was hearing about restrictions on her captors, boundaries they had imposed upon themselves. The translator repeated the key phrase again, as though anticipating disbelief. Personal contact is forbidden. This is not negotiable. This is the Geneva Convention. She wanted to laugh or cry or scream, but instead she simply nodded and moved to the next station where a medical technician waited with a stethoscope and blood pressure cuff. The examination was quick and impersonal. The technician, a woman barely older than herself, checked her vital signs and made notes on a chart without asking anything beyond the necessary medical questions filtered through the translator. When the young nurse winced at the pressure on a bruised arm sustained during the surrender, the technician's hands gentled immediately, but without any accompanying words of comfort or sympathy. Just an adjustment of technique, a professional accommodation of injury, and then the examination continued. She noticed that the medical staff all wore gloves, that they maintained a careful physical distance even while performing necessary examinations, that every interaction was bounded by protocols she had never encountered before. In the military hospitals where she had trained, boundaries between staff and patients were far more fluid, relationships more personal. This rigid separation felt alien and somehow more absolute than the barbed wire fence. After the medical screening came inoculation against diseases she had never heard of, administered with such swift efficiency that she barely had time to feel anxious. The nurse who gave the injection worked in silence, swabbed the site with alcohol, disposed of the syringe in a designated container, and marked her chart without a single extraneous word or gesture. No reassurance, no small talk, no acknowledgement of the fear that must have been written clearly across every prisoner's face. Just procedure, endless procedure, as though they were processing cargo rather than human beings. And yet there was something in this very impersonality that began to register as its own form of respect. They were not being treated as spoils of war or as objects of contempt. They were being processed according to regulations that appeared to make no distinction between willing and unwilling participants in the machinery of captivity. At the far end of the tent, mounted prominently where it could not be missed, hung a large sign printed in both English and Japanese characters. The Japanese text read, "All interactions between United States military personnel and prisoners of war will be conducted through official channels only. No personal contact is permitted outside of assigned duties. Requests must be submitted to Camp Command." She stared at those words, trying to reconcile them with every story she had been told about what happened to captured women, every warning about the lack of honor among enemy soldiers, every piece of propaganda that had painted Americans as little better than animals in their treatment of prisoners. The sign suggested something entirely different. It suggested a system so rigid that individual impulses, whether cruel or kind, had been systematically eliminated from the equation. As her group was directed toward the barracks that would serve as their housing, she found herself walking in a daze of cognitive dissonance. The other women around her whispered to each other in voices tight with confusion and residual fear. Where was the degradation they had been promised? Where were the guards who would assert their power through humiliation? Why had no one so much as raised their voice? The questions had no answers yet, only the evidence of what had not happened, which felt somehow more unsettling than any abuse would have been. At least abuse would have been comprehensible, would have fit the narrative they had been given. This careful, clinical processing defied every expectation and left nothing to replace those expectations except uncertainty. The barracks buildings stood in precise rows, each identical to the next, their wooden walls weathered but solid. Inside, the space was divided by rows of metal frame beds, each with a thin mattress, a folded blanket, and a pillow that looked nearly new. High windows let in light without offering any view of the camp beyond, and the floor had been swept clean. Everything spoke of order maintained not through fear, but through routine. 2 women in American military uniforms waited inside, both wearing the insignia that identified them as members of the Women's Army Corps. They introduced themselves through translation as the barracks supervisors, and they began distributing items from stacked crates near the door. Each prisoner received a uniform in a plain grey colour, 2 sets of undergarments, a towel, a bar of soap, and a printed schedule. The schedule was remarkably detailed. Wake-up would be at 5:30 in the morning, followed by personal hygiene time, breakfast at 6, roll call at 7, work assignments beginning at 8. Lunch at noon, afternoon work or recreation, dinner at 5:30, free time until 8:30, lights out at 9. Each activity was allocated its precise time slot, and the repetition of this structure implied that deviation was not anticipated or permitted. Additional rules filled the lower portion of the page. No unauthorized movement between barracks, no contact with guards except through supervisors, no personal items to be given to or received from military personnel. The restrictions went on and on, each one reinforcing the same theme of absolute separation between captor and captive. One of the supervisors, speaking through the translator, emphasized the consequences for rule violations. Any prisoner found attempting to establish personal relationships with guards would face disciplinary action. Any guard found fraternizing with prisoners would face court-martial. The system protected both sides through mutual isolation, and this protection was not optional. As the women began claiming beds and unpacking their meager belongings, conversations started up in hushed Japanese. Some speculated that the Americans were simply more subtle in their cruelty, that the true nature of the camp would reveal itself once the initial processing was complete. Others insisted that this was all propaganda, that foreign inspectors must be expected, that the facade would drop the moment such observers departed. A few, very few, began to consider the possibility that what they were seeing might actually represent the reality of their situation. The young nurse chose a bed near the window and sat down on the thin mattress, testing its firmness. Not comfortable, but far better than the ground where she had slept during the final chaotic days before surrender. She looked at the printed schedule again, running her finger down the columns of times and activities. There was something almost soothing about the predictability it promised, even as part of her insisted that such predictability must be illusion. She had been taught that war stripped away civilization, reduced everything to power and survival. Yet here was a system that seemed designed to maintain civilization even in captivity, to preserve structures and boundaries that should have been the first casualties of conflict. As evening approached and the light through the high windows turned golden, a meal was delivered on wheeled carts. Not individual plates, but serving trays from which the prisoners could help themselves, and the food was plain but substantial. Rice, vegetables, some kind of stewed meat that she did not recognize but that smelled edible. The women lined up with the tin plates they had been issued, filled them according to their appetite, and returned to their beds to eat. Not one guard entered the barracks during the meal. The carts had been wheeled in by civilians, camp workers who performed their task and departed without comment. The women ate in relative silence, each processing this strange new world in her own way. When someone dropped her plate and the contents spilled across the floor, one of the WAC supervisors simply handed her a fresh plate and directed a worker to clean up the mess. No punishment, no lecture, just practical problem-solving. After the meal, the empty carts were wheeled out and the barracks settled into the rhythm of evening. Women washed their plates in the communal sinks, changed into the provided nightclothes, and began preparing for sleep, even though full darkness was still an hour away. The young nurse used the time to write in a small notebook she had managed to keep hidden during her capture. Her handwriting was cramped and careful, preserving space on the precious paper. She wrote about the journey, about the intake process, about the strange absence of the cruelty she had been trained to expect. She wrote, "They treat us as though we are invisible except on paper. Every interaction is recorded, every need anticipated by regulation. The guards do not look at us. When they must speak to us, they speak through interpreters as though we exist in separate worlds. I do not understand this. I was told they would be undisciplined, that their army was chaotic and their men uncontrolled. Instead, I find control so absolute it feels mechanical. Perhaps this is worse. Perhaps being acknowledged as human, even as enemy, would be easier than this reduction to processed numbers." When lights out was called, the barracks descended into darkness, broken only by moonlight through the windows. She lay on her back, staring up at shadows on the ceiling, listening to the breathing of dozens of other women. Outside, she could hear the measured footsteps of guards on patrol, their rhythm as precise as everything else in this place. Sleep came slowly, her mind still churning through contradictions. But for the first time since her surrender, she slept without expecting to be woken by violence. Days accumulated into a pattern. Each morning began with the same routine: wake-up call, ablutions, breakfast, roll call. The repetition should have been numbing, but instead it created a framework within which the women began to reconstruct some sense of normalcy. They learned which guard walked which patrol route at which hour. They learned the faces of the civilian workers who delivered meals and supplies. They learned to navigate the spaces they were permitted to occupy without transgressing boundaries that remained invisible but absolute. The young nurse found herself assigned to work in the camp's laundry facility, a large building filled with industrial washing machines and long tables for folding. The work was hot and tedious, but no more demanding than her previous duties, and it came with the benefit of structure. Hours passed quickly when hands were busy, and the rhythmic process of washing and folding and stacking clean linens became almost meditative. She worked alongside other prisoners, and they developed a wordless cooperation born of shared task and shared captivity. Guards supervised the work, but always from a distance, stationed at doorways or along walls where they could observe without interfering. When mechanical problems arose, civilian technicians were called to make repairs. When supplies ran low, requisition forms were filled out and submitted through official channels. Every aspect of operation flowed through proper procedures, and nowhere in those procedures was there space for personal interaction between prisoner and guard. During the first week, one of the women working at the laundry tried to offer a thank you to a guard who had helped her lift a heavy basket of wet sheets. She bowed in the traditional manner and spoke a few words of English she had learned. The guard's response was to step back immediately, his face showing something close to alarm, and he gestured sharply for the WAC supervisor to intervene. Through translation, the prisoner was reminded of the non-fraternization policy and told that gratitude could only be expressed through official channels if necessary at all. The incident left the woman humiliated and confused, but it also reinforced the lesson. The boundaries were real and would be enforced without exception. The young nurse witnessed this exchange and filed it away as further evidence of the strange discipline that governed the camp. She had grown up in a culture where small gestures of gratitude and obligation wove the social fabric, where relationships were built through careful attention to hierarchical courtesies. This American system obliterated all of that, replaced it with something stark and impersonal. And yet, as the days passed, she began to see unexpected benefits in this impersonality. Without the possibility of currying favour, all prisoners stood on equal footing. Without the potential for exploitation of relationships, the only currency was compliance with rules that applied universally. It was egalitarian in a way she had never experienced, even if that equality existed within the framework of imprisonment. Mail became a lifeline. Once every 2 weeks, the prisoners were given sheets of paper and access to pens, and they were permitted to write letters home. The restrictions were made clear. No information about camp location or layout, no coded messages, nothing that could conceivably be used for intelligence purposes. Every letter would be read and censored before being sent. But within those constraints, they could write what they wished. The young nurse spent hours composing her first letter, choosing each word with care. How could she explain this experience to her family, who had undoubtedly been told she was dead or worse? How could she describe being captured without describing the battle that preceded it, being imprisoned without making her captors sound either monstrous or admirable? In the end, she wrote simply and truthfully. She was alive. She was unharmed. She was being held in a camp where rules governed every interaction, and where those rules seemed designed to prevent both cruelty and kindness from disrupting the mechanical routine. She described the barracks, the work assignments, the meals that were plain but sufficient. She did not describe her own confusion or the slow erosion of her fear. When the letters were collected for review, she felt as though she had sent a piece of herself back across the ocean, a message in a bottle that might or might not reach its destination. Weeks later, replies began to arrive. Not every prisoner received mail, and those who did clustered together to share the news from home, translating for those whose family members had written in difficult dialects or formal language. The young nurse's letter from her mother was brief and careful, clearly written with the awareness that it too would be censored. Her mother confirmed that the family had indeed believed her dead, that the formal notification had come weeks ago. The relief of knowing she lived was tempered by the shame of her capture, but her mother's words made clear that shame was secondary to gratitude. "Survive," her mother wrote. "Whatever you must do to survive, do it. Come home to us." That simple permission unlocked something in the young nurse's heart. She had been carrying the weight of dishonor, the burden of having been captured rather than dying in service. But her mother's letter reframed survival as itself a form of duty, an obligation to family that superseded military codes of honor. After reading those words, she found she could breathe more easily, could begin to imagine a future beyond the fence. Other women shared their letters, and a picture of the home front began to emerge. Cities under constant bombardment, rationing growing more severe, civilian populations mobilized for total war. The news was grim, but also strangely distant, as though it described events on another planet rather than the country of their birth. Here in Texas, the war seemed abstract, reduced to the fact of their imprisonment, but otherwise invisible. Days were governed by laundry shifts and meal times, not by air raids or advancing armies. This disconnection from the larger conflict created a kind of psychological cocoon, and within that cocoon, the prisoners began to heal in small ways. The constant fear that had defined the last months before surrender began to recede, replaced by the duller anxiety of uncertain future. But uncertain was better than immediately threatening, and gradually the women allowed themselves to feel something other than dread. The young nurse noticed changes in herself. She stopped flinching when guards walked past. She stopped scanning every American face for signs of hostile intent. The mechanical routine had lulled her into a state that was not quite trust, but was at least the absence of active fear. She began to pay attention to other details, the way the camp was maintained with obsessive care, the grass kept trimmed, the buildings painted and repaired, the supply systems functioning with Swiss precision. Everything spoke of resources deployed abundantly, of an administrative apparatus so vast that this one camp was merely a tiny component in a machine of incomprehensible scale. It was during her third week that she witnessed something that crystallized her understanding of the American approach. A prisoner collapsed during work detail, overcome by heat despite the precautions that had been taken. The guard nearest to the incident immediately called for medical assistance, and within minutes a team arrived with a stretcher. The woman was carried to the infirmary, examined by doctors, treated for dehydration and heat exhaustion, and kept overnight for observation. The response was swift and professional and utterly devoid of either compassion or contempt. The woman was a problem to be solved, a breakdown in the system that required correcting, and the machinery of care moved efficiently to restore proper function. When the woman returned to the barracks the following day, she carried a note excusing her from outdoor work for 3 days and assigning her to lighter duty. No punishment for her weakness, no mockery of her collapse, just an adjustment to the system, a reallocation of resources to match current capabilities. The young nurse understood then that the Americans had not simply built a prison camp. They had built a functioning institution designed to process and maintain human beings according to specifications laid out in international law, and they operated that institution with the same meticulous attention to detail that they presumably brought to every other aspect of their war effort. This was not kindness. This was not cruelty. This was administration raised to the level of philosophy, and it was more thoroughly effective than either kindness or cruelty could have been. The prisoners could not rebel against care that manifested as regulation. They could not resent guards who treated them as inventory to be maintained rather than as enemies to be subjugated. The system was simultaneously impersonal and absolutely comprehensive, and within its bounds they found themselves adjusting, adapting, beginning to function according to its rhythms. As summer deepened and the Texas heat became oppressive even in early morning, adjustments were made to the schedule. Work shifts were shortened during the hottest hours, additional water stations appeared throughout the camp, and the women were issued lighter clothing better suited to the climate. Each change arrived through official channels, announced via the bulletin board that had become the primary source of information. No explanation was offered for these modifications beyond the practical, no appeal made for gratitude or cooperation. The system had identified inefficiencies and corrected them. Nothing more. The bulletin board itself became a focal point of camp life. Posted in both English and Japanese, it carried announcements about schedule changes, supply deliveries, mail arrivals, and occasionally updates on policies. The women checked it daily, some multiple times, as though the board might reveal some hidden truth about their situation or offer news of the war's progress. But the board dealt only in immediate practicalities, and any news of the broader conflict had to be gleaned from scattered comments overheard from guards or rumours passed between prisoners. One notice that appeared in late summer caused considerable discussion. The camp administration was establishing a small library where prisoners could check out books, primarily in English, but with a growing collection in Japanese. The books would be screened for appropriate content, but within those guidelines, reading material would be available for recreation during evening hours. The announcement struck many as bizarre. Why would their captors provide entertainment, invest resources in something that had no practical purpose beyond prisoner morale? But when the library opened in a converted storage room, the women who visited found exactly what had been promised. Shelves of books, a simple checkout system managed by a WAC volunteer, and rules prohibiting any damage or loss of materials. The young nurse checked out a Japanese translation of an American novel she had never heard of, a story about farming during difficult times, and she spent her evenings reading by the available light. The act of reading for pleasure, of entering a fictional world distinct from both her past and her present, felt subversive somehow. But no one stopped her. No one questioned her choice of books. The library was simply there, another component of the system, operating according to its designated function.